she begged the Lakota warrior. "Please don't touch me." But he had to save her life. The winter of 1876 arrived early in the Dakota Territory that year. By mid-November, the first heavy snows had already begun to blanket the endless plains in white. It was during this harsh season that Sarah Mitchell found herself traveling westward, far from everything she had ever known. At 19 years old, she had lived her entire life in Boston, surrounded by brick buildings, cobblestone streets, and the strict rules of proper society. Her world had been one of Sunday church services, tea parties with carefully measured conversation, and the constant reminder from her mother about what a young lady should and should not do. Sarah had accepted a position as a school teacher at a small settlement near Fort Laramie. The decision had shocked her family. Her mother had wept for 3 days straight, convinced that her daughter was throwing her life away. Her father had tried to forbid it, but Sarah possessed a stubborn streak that surprised even herself. She wanted adventure. She wanted to matter. She wanted to do something meaningful with her life beyond waiting for a suitable marriage proposal from one of Boston's eligible young men. The journey west had taken weeks. Sarah had traveled by train as far as the rails would carry her, then transferred to a stagecoach for the final leg of the journey. She shared the cramped coach with 4 other passengers: a gruff older man named Thomas, who claimed to be a prospector, a young married couple heading to start a ranch, and a traveling salesman who wouldn't stop talking about his various wares. The driver, a weathered man named Jack who had made this route dozens of times, assured them all that they would reach Fort Laramie before the worst of the winter set in. Sarah spent the long hours staring out the window at the changing landscape. As they moved further west, the familiar gave way to the foreign. The rolling hills became flat plains that stretched endlessly in every direction. The trees grew sparse and then disappeared almost entirely. The sky seemed bigger somehow, more vast and overwhelming than any sky she had seen in Boston. At night, when they stopped at crude way stations, Sarah would lie awake listening to sounds she couldn't identify, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. The other passengers talked sometimes about the native tribes that lived in these territories. The prospector, Thomas, seemed to take particular pleasure in sharing gruesome stories he claimed were true. Tales of attacks on settlers, of people scalped and left for dead, of women carried off never to be seen again. Sarah would feel her stomach turn as he spoke, but she couldn't bring herself to stop listening. Before leaving Boston, she had read every newspaper article she could find about the West. Many of them painted terrifying pictures of the indigenous peoples who called these lands home. Her mother had begged her to reconsider, showing her headlines that screamed of danger and death. Sarah had grown up in a world where she had never seen a Native American person except in drawings and photographs. In her mind, they had become something almost mythical, dangerous figures lurking in the wilderness waiting to harm innocent travelers. Her church had taught her that it was the duty of civilized people to bring Christianity and proper culture to the savage lands. She believed these things because she had never been given reason to question them. Everyone she knew believed the same. On the morning of November 18th, the stagecoach set out from the last way station before Fort Laramie. Jack, the driver, seemed nervous. He kept looking at the sky, which had turned a peculiar gray color that Sarah had never seen before. The air felt heavy and cold in a way that seemed to press down on everything. The young wife in the coach mentioned that it felt like snow was coming, and her husband agreed, wrapping his arm around her protectively. By midday, the first flakes began to fall. They were small at first, almost delicate, drifting lazily through the air. Sarah pressed her face to the window, watching them swirl and dance. She had seen snow many times in Boston, but something about the snow here felt different, more ominous. Within an hour, those delicate flakes had become a torrent. The wind picked up, howling around the coach like a living thing. Visibility dropped until Sarah could barely see 10 feet beyond the window. Jack shouted something from his seat up top, but the wind tore his words away. The coach began to sway and lurch as the horses struggled through deepening drifts. Sarah gripped the edge of her seat, her heart beginning to pound. The salesman had stopped talking, his face pale. Thomas muttered something about fool drivers who didn't know when to turn back. The young couple held each other tightly. The world outside the window became nothing but white. Sarah couldn't tell where the ground ended and the sky began. Everything merged into a blinding, swirling chaos. The coach tilted at a sharp angle, and Sarah heard one of the horses scream, a sound so filled with terror that it froze her blood. Then everything happened at once. There was a tremendous crack, the sound of wood splintering. The coach lurched violently to one side. Sarah felt herself thrown against the wall, then the ceiling, then she didn't know which direction was which anymore. She heard screaming, both human and animal. Something struck her leg with tremendous force, and pain exploded through her entire body. The world spun and tumbled, and then there was a final, crushing impact that drove all the air from her lungs. Silence followed. Or perhaps it wasn't silence, but Sarah's ears had stopped working properly. She lay still, afraid to move, afraid to open her eyes. Slowly, sensation returned. Pain in her leg, sharp and terrible. Cold seeping through her clothes, the muffled howl of wind. She forced her eyes open and found herself staring at splintered wood and torn leather. The coach had overturned and broken apart. Sarah tried to move and gasped at the agony that shot through her left leg. She looked down and felt bile rise in her throat. Her leg bent at an angle that was completely wrong. She knew, even through her shock, that it was broken badly. Blood stained her dress, though she couldn't tell if it was hers or someone else's. She called out weakly for help, but if anyone answered, she couldn't hear them over the storm. Using her arms, Sarah began to drag herself through the wreckage. She found Thomas first. His eyes were open and staring at nothing, his neck twisted impossibly to one side. Sarah bit back a scream and kept moving. The young couple lay tangled together in a way that made Sarah's chest tighten with grief. The wife's hand still clutched her husband's coat. Neither of them was breathing. The salesman was simply gone, perhaps thrown from the coach entirely. Sarah pulled herself free of the wreckage and out into the full fury of the blizzard. The cold hit her like a physical blow. Snow immediately began to cover her, clinging to her wet clothes and exposed skin. She couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The idea which way to go or what to do. Her broken leg left a trail of red in the white snow as she dragged herself forward, moving on pure survival instinct with no real destination in mind. The cold became everything. It crept into her bones, making her movements slower and clumsier. Her hands went numb, then her face. She couldn't feel her leg anymore, which seemed like a mercy at first, but then she realized the terrible danger of that numbness. Sarah had read about people freezing to death. She knew the signs, the drowsiness that was creeping over her now, the strange warmth that was beginning to replace the cold, the desire to simply stop moving and rest. She collapsed into a snowdrift, unable to go any further. The wind piled snow around her, nature already beginning to bury her. Sarah thought about her mother and father back in Boston. She thought about the school children she would never teach. She thought about all the things she had wanted to do with her life, all the adventures she had dreamed about during those long, boring afternoons in her parents' parlor. It seemed terribly unfair that it should end like this, alone in the wilderness, her body destined to be lost until spring thaw revealed what remained. Her eyes drifted closed. The world became distant and unimportant. Sarah felt herself slipping away, and she was almost grateful for it. At least there would be no more pain, no more fear. She whispered a prayer, the same prayer her mother had taught her as a child, though she wasn't certain anyone was listening anymore. She didn't know how long she lay there. Time lost all meaning. But then something changed. She felt movement nearby, the sense of a presence. Through the howling wind she heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm. Sarah forced her eyes open just a crack and saw a shape moving toward her through the white. At first she thought she was dreaming or hallucinating, but the shape became clearer, more defined. A person. Someone had found her. Relief flooded through her for just a moment. Then her vision cleared enough to truly see her rescuer, and relief transformed instantly into pure terror. The figure standing over Sarah was unlike anyone she had ever seen in her sheltered Boston life. Through the swirling snow she could make out a tall man dressed in clothing made from animal hides and furs. His long black hair whipped in the wind, and his face, partially covered against the cold, showed features that confirmed her worst fears. He was one of them. One of the people from all those terrible stories she had heard. A native warrior standing in the middle of the blizzard, looking down at her broken body half buried in the snow. Every story Thomas had told in the stagecoach came rushing back to her mind. Every newspaper headline she had read in Boston. Every warning her mother had given her before she left. Sarah's heart, which had been slowing from the cold, suddenly began racing with fresh terror. She tried to move away from him, but her body wouldn't respond properly. Her broken leg was useless, and her arms had no strength left. All she could do was stare up at him with wide, frightened eyes. The man knelt down beside her, reaching out with his hands. Sarah found her voice then, weak and cracking, but desperate. "Please," she whispered through chattering teeth. "Please don't touch me. Please leave me alone." She tried to push his hands away, but her frozen fingers couldn't grasp anything. "Please, I'm begging you, don't touch me." The warrior said something in a language she couldn't understand. His voice was deep and calm, so different from what she had expected. But Sarah was beyond reason. All she could think about were those horrible stories about women being taken, about unspeakable things happening in the wilderness far from civilization. Even facing certain death from the cold, her fear of this stranger was stronger. She would rather freeze than be touched by him. He reached for her again, and Sarah used the last of her energy to weakly bat at his hands. "No, no, please," she begged, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Just leave me here. Please just go away." Her mind was a chaos of terror and confusion. She couldn't think clearly. She didn't understand that the cold was killing her right now, this very moment, while her imagined fears were just that, imagined. The warrior sat back on his heels for a moment, studying her. Sarah could see his eyes now, dark and intelligent, looking at her with what seemed like concern rather than menace. But she couldn't trust her own perceptions. Everything she had been taught told her to fear this man. He said something else in his language, speaking slowly as if trying to make her understand through tone, if not through words. Then he looked at her leg, at the unnatural angle of it, at the blood staining the snow around her. He looked at her wet clothes, already beginning to freeze stiff. He looked at her blue-tinged fingers and lips. He made a decision. Despite her protests, despite her fear, he reached down and lifted her from the snow. Sarah cried out, trying to fight him, but her body was too weak and too cold. He was incredibly strong, lifting her as easily as if she weighed nothing. He wrapped a thick fur robe around her, tucking it tightly to trap what little body heat she had left. The fur smelled of smoke and the outdoors, unfamiliar but not unpleasant. Sarah continued to whimper and beg, her words becoming less coherent as her mind struggled against both cold and panic. "Please don't do this," she whispered against his chest, where he had pulled her to shelter her from the worst of the wind. "Please let me go. Please, I'm begging you. Don't touch me. Don't hurt me. Please just leave me alone." Over and over she repeated these pleas, even as he began walking through the blizzard with steady, sure steps. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, even though Sarah couldn't see anything but white in every direction. The warrior didn't respond to her begging except to hold her more securely when she tried to struggle. His grip was firm but not painful. He moved with purpose through the storm, occasionally pausing to get his bearings, then continuing in what Sarah assumed was a straight line, though she had completely lost all sense of direction. She drifted in and out of consciousness, the combination of cold, pain, and fear taking their toll on her exhausted mind. Each time she woke, she experienced the same jolt of terror, finding herself in the stranger's arms. Each time she would begin pleading again, her voice growing weaker. "Please don't touch me. Please let me go. I want to go home. Please, please don't hurt me." The words became a kind of prayer, repeated without conscious thought. The warrior never answered, never showed anger at her constant begging. He simply kept walking, his breathing steady despite the weight he carried and the difficulty of moving through deep snow. Sarah's mind began playing tricks on her. She thought she saw her mother standing in the snow, shaking her head in disappointment. She thought she heard her father calling her name. She saw the face of the young wife from the stagecoach asking why Sarah had survived when she had not. The boundary between reality and hallucination blurred until Sarah couldn't tell what was real anymore. Through her delirium, she became aware that they had stopped moving. The howling wind seemed slightly quieter, though still terribly loud. The warrior knelt down, still holding her, and seemed to be doing something with his free hand. Sarah felt herself being lowered onto cold stone. They were in some kind of cave or rocky shelter, she realized dimly. A small opening in the hillside that cut the wind. It was still freezing cold, but at least they were out of the direct assault of the blizzard. The warrior laid her down gently on the stone floor and stepped away. Sarah's relief at being released lasted only a moment before new fears crashed over her. What was he planning? Why had he brought her here to this isolated place where no one could hear her scream? She tried to sit up, to drag herself toward the cave entrance, but her body absolutely refused to obey. She could barely lift her head. The warrior was moving around the small space with efficient purpose. Sarah watched through half-closed eyes as he gathered dried wood and kindling that had apparently been stored here previously. He must use this place regularly, she thought. A winter shelter, perhaps. With practiced movements, he built a small fire using a method Sarah didn't understand, creating sparks with pieces of stone and metal. Within minutes, flames began to grow, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. The light from the fire allowed Sarah to see her rescuer more clearly for the first time. He was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s. His face was strong and weathered by outdoor life, with high cheekbones and a straight nose. His clothes were practical and well-made, designed for survival in harsh conditions. He wore his hair in 2 long braids, and around his neck hung what looked like a necklace made of bone and beads. Everything about him spoke of someone who lived close to the land, who understood this environment in ways Sarah never could. As the fire grew stronger, the warrior turned his attention back to Sarah. He approached her again, and immediately she began her desperate pleas once more. "Please don't touch me, I'm begging you, please just leave me alone." Her voice was barely a whisper now, raw from crying and weak from cold. "Whatever you're planning to do, please don't. Please, I just want to go home." The warrior spoke again in his own language, his tone patient but firm. He pointed to her clothes, which were soaked through and beginning to freeze to her skin. He pointed to the fire, asking themselves about what he was trying to communicate, and devastating worm Sarah understood what he was trying to communicate, and horror filled her. "No," she said, trying to sound forceful but only managing to sound terrified. "No, you can't. Please don't, I'm begging you, don't touch me, don't take my clothes. Please, please, I'd rather die. Do you understand? I'd rather die than let you do this." The warrior looked at her for a long moment, and Sarah thought she saw something like sadness in his eyes. He spoke again, and though she couldn't understand the words, his tone was gentle, almost apologetic. He seemed to be trying to explain something to her, trying to make her understand. But Sarah was beyond understanding. All of her upbringing, all of her fears, all of her prejudices had formed an impenetrable wall between them. Dessert. He reached into a bag he carried and pulled out what looked like dried meat. He offered it to her, but Sarah turned her head away. He set it down beside her along with what appeared to be a water skin. Then he sat back and seemed to think, looking from Sarah to the fire and back again. Sarah could see him wrestling with a decision, and her terror grew with each passing second. The warrior stood and walked to the cave entrance, looking out at the raging storm. It showed no signs of letting up. In fact, if anything, it seemed to be getting worse. He turned back to look at Sarah, at her wet clothes, at her blue lips and shivering body. He looked at her broken leg, twisted and swelling. He seemed to come to some conclusion. He approached her again, speaking in his language, but with a tone that sounded like he was trying to comfort her, to explain what he needed to do. Sarah understood nothing except that he was coming toward her with clear purpose in his eyes. She began to cry, great shaking sobs that hurt her chest. "Please don't touch me," she begged one more time. "Please, I'm so scared. Please don't do this. Please, please, please don't touch me." The warrior hesitated, and for a moment Sarah thought her pleas had reached him. But then he looked again at her frozen clothing, at the way her whole body shook with violent shivers, at the dangerous blue color of her skin. He knelt beside her and began to work, and Sarah closed her eyes and wept, certain that all her worst fears were about to come true, unable to understand that this stranger was actually trying to save her life. The warrior's hands moved toward the buttons of Sarah's heavy winter coat, and she flinched violently despite her weakened state. Every fiber of her being screamed in protest. In Boston, no man outside her immediate family had ever seen her without proper dress. The very thought of being undressed, especially by a stranger, especially by someone she had been taught to fear, was more terrifying to her than the cold that was steadily killing her. "Please stop," she whispered, tears streaming down her frozen cheeks. "You don't have to do this. Please, I'll be fine. Just leave my clothes alone. Please, I'm begging you." Her words tumbled out in a desperate rush, even though she knew he couldn't understand most of what she was saying. The warrior paused and looked directly into her eyes. He spoke slowly and clearly, and though Sarah didn't know his language, something in his tone penetrated her panic. He wasn't speaking with cruelty or threat. His voice carried patience, determination, and what almost sounded like reassurance. He pointed to her clothes again, then made a gesture as if something was freezing solid. He pointed to the fire, then wrapped his arms around himself and pretended to shiver violently. Then he stopped to pretend shivering and nodded, as if to say, "This is what warmth looks like." Sarah wanted to understand, wanted to believe that his intentions were good, but her fear was too deeply rooted. She shook her head frantically. No, please, I don't care if I'm cold. I don't care. Just don't touch me. Please don't undress me. I'm begging you, have mercy." But the warrior had made his decision. He began unbuttoning her coat, his movements careful and deliberate. Sarah tried to push his hands away, but her frozen fingers had no strength. She tried to curl away from him, but her broken legs sent such shooting pain through her body that she cried out and had to stop moving. She was completely helpless, utterly at his mercy, and the realization made her sob even harder. As he removed her coat, the warrior kept his eyes focused on his task, not looking at her face or anything else unnecessarily. There was something almost clinical about his movements, like a doctor performing necessary treatment. But Sarah couldn't see this through her terror. All she knew was that a strange man was removing her clothing in a cave far from civilization, and no one would ever know what happened to her. Her dress came next, the heavy wool soaked through and frozen in places. The warrior had to work carefully to peel it away from her skin. Underneath, her undergarments were equally wet. Sarah's crying became incoherent begging, words and sobs mixing together into sounds of pure distress. "Please, please, please," she kept repeating like it was the only word she knew. "Don't do this, please. I'm so scared. Please stop. Please don't touch me." Throughout this ordeal, the warrior maintained his respectful distance as much as possible. When he had to touch her skin, his hands were gentle and quick. He showed no interest in looking at her body beyond what was necessary to complete his task. In fact, he deliberately turned his face away several times, seeming to understand her distress even if he didn't understand her words. But Sarah was too frightened to notice these signs of respect. In her mind, the worst was happening, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Once he had removed all of her wet clothing, the warrior immediately wrapped her in thick, dry furs. They were warm from being near the fire, and the relief to her frozen skin was immediate and intense. He wrapped her completely, covering her from neck to toes, leaving only her face exposed. Then he did something that surprised Sarah in her misery. He moved away from her, going to the opposite side of the small cave, giving her as much space as the confined area would allow. He hung her wet clothes near the fire on sticks he had positioned for that purpose. Steam began to rise from the fabric almost immediately. Then he turned his attention to preparing something, though Sarah couldn't see what through her tears in the poor light. She lay wrapped in the furs, still shaking partly from cold and partly from fear, watching him with wide, terrified eyes. The warrior spoke to her occasionally in his own language, his tone conversational, almost soothing. It was as if he was trying to calm a frightened animal. Sarah didn't respond, couldn't respond. She just watched him, waiting for something terrible to happen, unable to believe that maybe, possibly, he had finished doing what he needed to do and would leave her alone now. After several minutes, he approached her again, and Sarah's whole body tensed, but he only held out a piece of the dried meat he had shown her earlier. When she didn't take it, he placed it beside her and retreated again. He seemed to be trying to show her that he meant no harm, that the worst was over. But Sarah's mind couldn't accept this yet. She remained rigid with fear, certain that this was just a pause before something worse. The warrior then did something that confused Sarah completely. He picked up her broken leg, and she screamed, expecting terrible pain, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He examined the break carefully, his fingers probing the swollen, bruised flesh with the skill of someone who had done this before. He spoke to himself in his language, seeming to assess the damage. Then he looked around the cave and began gathering materials. Sarah watched in bewilderment as he took 2 straight pieces of wood from his supply pile and what looked like strips of leather. He positioned himself near her leg again, and this time he looked at her face and held up the pieces of wood, then pointed to her leg. He seemed to be trying to tell her what he was about to do. Sarah understood in a flash. He was going to set her broken leg. "No, please," she said, fresh panic rising. "That's going to hurt. Please don't. Just leave it. Please, I can't take any more. I can't." But even as she protested, some rational part of her mind knew that a broken leg left untreated could mean death or permanent disability. If she survived this day at all, she would need her leg to be properly set. The warrior seemed to understand her fear of pain. He held up one hand in a gesture that clearly meant wait. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out a small leather pouch. From this, he took what looked like dried leaves or plant material. The boss of his raise, he made a gesture of chewing and swallowing, then pointed to her and made a sleeping motion, laying his head on his hands. He was offering her something for the pain, something that might make her sleep through the worst of it. Sarah stared at the dried plant material in his hand. It could be anything. It could be poison for all she knew, but the pain in her leg was becoming unbearable now that she was warming up, and the thought of him manipulating the broken bone while she was fully conscious was too much to bear. With a shaking hand, she reached out and took the medicine from him. He helped her sit up slightly and offered her water from his water skin to help her swallow the bitter leaves. The taste was awful, like chewing on tree bark, but Sarah forced it down. The warrior nodded approval and then sat back to wait for the medicine to take effect. He added more wood to the fire and checked her drying clothes. All the while, he hummed softly to himself, a melody that was foreign to Sarah's ears but somehow soothing. Gradually, Sarah began to feel strange. The sharp edges of her panic softened. The pain in her legs seemed to recede slightly, becoming more distant. Her eyelids grew heavy, and the cave around her took on a dreamy quality. She tried to fight the drowsiness, tried to stay alert, but her body had endured too much. The warmth of the furs, the crackling of the fire, and whatever medicine he had given her all combined to pull her towards sleep. The last thing she remembered clearly was the warrior moving closer to her leg, his hands steady and sure. She felt pressure and then a sharp spike of pain that cut through even the medicine's haze. She cried out, but the sound seemed to come from far away. Then the warrior's voice was there, speaking in his language, but in a tone so gentle and reassuring that it penetrated her confused state. He kept talking to her, a steady stream of words she couldn't understand, but that somehow helped, giving her something to focus on besides the pain. He worked quickly and skillfully. Sarah felt him straighten her leg, felt the grinding sensation of bone against bone that made her stomach turn. But the medicine kept her from fully experiencing the agony that should have accompanied such treatment. He positioned the wooden splints on either side of her leg and began wrapping them securely with the leather strips, binding everything firmly but not so tight as to cut off circulation. Through her drugged haze, Sarah realized something that shocked her. This man knew what he was doing. He was treating her injury with skill and care. This wasn't the action of someone who meant her harm. This was the action of someone trying to save her life. The realization tried to take root in her mind, but years of prejudice and fear fought against it. When he finished with her leg, the warrior examined her hands and feet. Sarah's fingers and toes had turned an alarming white color from frostbite. The warrior made a concerned sound and began a treatment that seemed bizarre to Sarah. He gathered snow from near the cave entrance and began rubbing it gently on her frozen extremities. The sensation was terrible, burning and tingling as feeling slowly returned to the damaged tissue. Sarah whimpered but didn't have the strength to pull away. He worked methodically, first with snow and then gradually with warmer water heated by the fire. He massaged her fingers and toes carefully, encouraging blood flow back into the frozen flesh. Sarah watched his face as he worked, and through her medicine-clouded vision she saw nothing but concentration and concern. His brow was furrowed with focus, and occasionally he would make small sounds of what seemed like satisfaction when he saw improvement. The treatment went on for what felt like hours. The warrior never rushed, never showed impatience or frustration. He simply continued his careful work, alternating between her hands and feet, checking her leg periodically, adding wood to the fire to keep the cave warm. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage with undiminished fury. The wind howled like wolves and snow drifted against the cave entrance, partially blocking it and helping to keep the warmth inside. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she would wake to find the warrior still working on her hands, rubbing them gently to restore circulation. Sometimes she would wake to find him sitting across the cave, watching the storm outside, his profile illuminated by firelight. Once she woke to find him checking her leg again, adjusting the splints slightly, his touch so careful that she barely felt it. Each time she woke, the same confusion washed over her. Who was this man? What did he want? Why was he helping her? And why, despite all her training and all her fears, did some part of her deep down begin to feel something that wasn't quite fear anymore? She couldn't name the feeling, couldn't fully acknowledge it yet, but it was there, growing slowly like a tiny seed pushing through frozen ground. The first full day in the cave passed in a haze for Sarah. The medicine the warrior had given her kept her drifting between sleep and wakefulness, never fully in either state. Each time she surfaced toward consciousness, she found him nearby but never threatening. He tended the fire constantly, keeping the small space warm enough for survival. He checked her injuries with gentle hands. He offered her water and small pieces of dried meat, encouraging her to eat even when she wanted to refuse. By the second morning, Sarah's mind had cleared somewhat, though her body still ached terribly. She woke to find weak daylight filtering through the cave entrance, though the storm still raged outside with barely diminished intensity. The warrior sat near the fire, working on something with his hands. As Sarah's eyes focused, she saw that he was repairing a torn section of her dress, using a bone needle and what looked like sinew as thread. His fingers moved with surprising skill, creating neat, small stitches. The sight struck Sarah as deeply strange. In her world, sewing was women's work, something no proper man would ever do. Yet here was this warrior, this person she had been taught to think of as savage and uncivilized, carefully mending her clothing with practiced ease. He seemed to sense her watching and looked up, meeting her eyes. For the first time since he had found her, Sarah didn't immediately look away in fear. They regarded each other in silence for a long moment. The warrior said something in his language, his tone questioning. Sarah understood he was asking how she felt, even if she couldn't understand the specific words. She tried to answer but found her throat too dry. He immediately set aside his sewing and brought her water, supporting her head gently as she drank. The water was cold and clean, the best thing Sarah had ever tasted. "Thank you," she whispered when she finished drinking. The warrior nodded, seeming to understand those words, or at least their meaning. He returned to his sewing, and Sarah lay watching him, her mind slowly beginning to work through everything that had happened. That was the first important fact. Against all odds, in the middle of a killer blizzard, with severe injuries that should have meant her death, she was alive, and she was alive because of this man. He had found her when no one else would have been out in such weather. He had carried her to shelter despite her protests and fear. He had treated her injuries with skill, he had kept her warm, and was now even mending her clothes. The realization brought a wave of shame so intense that Sarah felt her cheeks burning. She had begged him not to touch her. She had cried and pleaded as if he were a monster. She had believed, truly believed, that he meant to harm her. But every single action he had taken had been meant to save her life. While she had been consumed with baseless fear, he had been calmly doing what needed to be done to ensure her survival. Sarah thought about the stories Thomas had told in the stagecoach, the newspaper articles she had read, the warnings from her mother. She thought about how readily she had believed all of it, how she had never questioned whether any of it was true. She had created a monster in her mind and then projected that monster onto this real person who had shown her nothing but kindness and care. The warrior finished his sewing and held up her dress to examine his work. Satisfied, he set it aside and checked the other garments hanging near the fire. They were dry now, and he began to fold them carefully, treating her things with respect. Sarah watched his every movement, seeing him with new eyes. She noticed details she had been too frightened to see before. His clothing, while made from animal skins, was beautifully crafted. The stitching was even and strong, but decorative beadwork adorned the shoulders of his shirt in intricate patterns. His knife, sheathed at his side, had an elaborately carved handle. These were not the possessions of a savage. These were the possessions of someone from a culture with its own arts and skills, its own sense of beauty and craft. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, and fresh snow began to fall even more heavily than before. The warrior went to the cave entrance and looked out, his expression serious. He turned back to Sarah and made a gesture that seemed to indicate they would be here for some time yet. The storm was not finished with them. He settled back by the fire and pulled out more dried meat and what looked like dried berries from his supplies. He ate sparingly, Sarah noticed, and she realized with a start that he was rationing his food. He had probably brought enough for himself for a few days of hunting, not enough to feed two people trapped in a cave for an extended period. Yet he offered her an equal share without hesitation, never suggesting that she should eat less because these were his provisions. Sarah forced herself to eat, though her stomach was uncertain. She needed strength if she was going to heal. As she chewed the tough, smoky meat, she tried to think of how to communicate with this man, how to bridge the vast gap between them. She pointed to herself and said clearly, "Sarah." Then she pointed to him with a questioning look. The warrior understood immediately. He placed his hand on his chest and said something that sounded like 2 rivers. At least that's what Sarah thought she heard. The name seemed to reference water in some way, though she couldn't be certain. She tried to repeat it, stumbling over the unfamiliar syllables. He smiled for the first time since finding her, a small but genuine smile that transformed his serious face, and repeated his name more slowly. 2 rivers, Sarah said again, more carefully this time. He nodded approval, and Sarah felt an unexpected flush of pleasure at getting it right. It was such a small thing learning someone's name, but somehow it felt monumentally important. He wasn't just the warrior or the savage anymore. He was 2 rivers, a person with a name, an identity, a life beyond this cave. 2 rivers began to teach her other words. He pointed to the fire and said the word in his language. He pointed to the water, to the snow outside, to the furs wrapped around her. Sarah repeated each word carefully, her trained mind absorbing the new sounds. He seemed pleased by her willingness to learn, and the lessons became a way to pass the long hours as the storm continued its assault on the world outside. On the 3rd day, Sarah woke to a change in the sound. The constant howling of the wind had diminished somewhat. 2 Rivers was already awake, and he appeared to be preparing for something. He checked his supplies, organized his belongings, and examined the weather through the cave entrance with an assessing eye. Sarah watched with growing apprehension. Was he planning to leave? Was he going to abandon her here? But 2 Rivers came to her side and checked her injuries thoroughly. Her leg was still badly swollen, though the splints he had made held it securely. The frostbitten fingers and toes had regained most of their color, though they remained tender and sensitive. He seemed satisfied with her condition and began to explain something to her through gestures. He pointed outside, then made a walking motion with his fingers. He pointed to Sarah, then made a motion like pulling something. He was telling her that he would take her somewhere. that he would pull her. Sarah understood. The storm was breaking, and he was going to take her to safety, to people who could help her properly. Fear flickered through her again, but it was different now. She wasn't afraid of Two Rivers himself. She was afraid of being a burden, of slowing him down, of what might happen on the journey, but she nodded to show she understood. Two Rivers worked for the next hour, creating something Sarah had never seen before. Using long poles from his supply cache and strips of leather, along with some of the furs, he constructed a kind of sled that could be pulled behind him. He tested it carefully, making sure the joints were secure and the platform would hold Sarah's weight. Then he gently lifted her onto it, arranging furs around her to keep her warm and padding to protect her broken leg. Before they left, Two Rivers did something that surprised Sarah deeply. He knelt beside the fire and spoke to it in his language, his tone reverent. She realized he was saying some kind of prayer or blessing, thanking the fire perhaps for keeping them alive or asking for safe journey. The act of gratitude and spirituality was so familiar and yet so foreign. Sarah had prayed countless times in her life, but she had never thought that people from other cultures might also have their own ways of speaking to the divine. When Two Rivers finished his prayer, he looked at Sarah and seemed to make a decision. From a pouch at his waist, he pulled out a small object and handed it to her. It was a carefully carved piece of what looked like bone or antler, shaped into the form of some animal Sarah didn't recognize. It hung on a leather cord. Two Rivers placed it in her hand and closed her fingers around it, then touched his chest over his heart. Sarah understood. It was some kind of protective charm, something meaningful to him, and he was giving it to her. Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes. She couldn't speak, couldn't find words adequate to express what she was feeling. Instead, she clutched the small carving tightly and nodded, hoping he could see the gratitude in her face. Two Rivers nodded back, satisfied, and then stood to make final preparations. He secured Sarah to the travois carefully, making sure she couldn't fall off if the ground became rough. He draped additional furs over her to protect against the wind and cold. Then he positioned himself at the front of the makeshift sled, took hold of the pulling straps he had fashioned, and began to walk. The journey was difficult from the start. Even though the worst of the storm had passed, the wind was still strong and snow continued to fall. The drifts were deep in places, sometimes reaching Two Rivers' waist. He pulled steadily, never complaining, never showing frustration when the trave caught on something or when he had to backtrack to find easier passage. Sarah could see the tremendous effort it took, could see the strain in his shoulders and back as he hauled her weight through the unforgiving landscape. Hours passed. The world was nothing but white and gray, endless snow and leaden sky. Sarah had no idea how Two Rivers knew where he was going. There were no landmarks she could see, no roads or trails. Everything looked the same in every direction. Yet he moved with confidence, occasionally pausing to check the position of the weak sun through the clouds, or to read signs in the land that were invisible to Sarah's untrained eyes. She thought about the school children she had been traveling to teach. She thought about the settlement near Fort Laramie that had been her destination. She wondered if anyone there knew about the stagecoach, if anyone was looking for survivors. She wondered what they would think when Two Rivers arrived with her. Would they thank him for saving her? Or would they treat him with the same prejudice and fear that she had shown? The thought troubled Sarah deeply. She realized that she wanted people to see Two Rivers as she was beginning to see him. Not as a threat or a savage, but as a skilled, honorable person who had risked his own safety to save a stranger's life. She wanted them to know about the gentle way he had treated her injuries, about the patient way he had taught her words in his language, about the precious charm he had given her for protection. But she also knew how people thought. She knew because she had thought that way herself just days ago. She knew the stories people told, the fears they harbored, the walls they built between themselves and anyone different. Could she make them understand? Could she help them see what she had learned in that cave during 3 days of enforced closeness with someone she had been taught to fear? Sarah didn't know. But as Two Rivers continued to pull her through the snow, never faltering, never giving up, she knew she had to try. This man had saved her life in every way possible. The least she could do was try to save his reputation, to speak truth against the lies and prejudice she now knew were so deeply wrong. She gripped the carved charm he had given her and made a silent promise. She would tell her story, the true story, of the Lakota warrior who had refused to leave her to die, even when she had begged him not to touch her. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Sarah first spotted the distant outline of buildings. Fort Laramie emerged from the white landscape like a mirage, its wooden walls and structures promising safety and familiar civilization above the site. But immediately she felt something unexpected, A sense of sadness mixed with her relief. Once they reached the fort, her time with Two Rivers would end. He would return to his own people, his own life, and she would likely never see him again. But he paused for a moment, and Sarah thought she detected hesitation in his posture. She understood why. Walking into a military fort as a Lakota warrior, especially while bringing an injured white woman, could be dangerous for him. The soldiers might not wait to hear explanations before reacting with suspicion or hostility. Yet he continued forward without turning back, his steps steady and purposeful. As they drew closer, Sarah saw figures moving on the fort's walls. Someone had spotted them. Within minutes, she could hear shouting, the sound of urgent voices calling out warnings and orders. A group of soldiers came rushing out through the fort's gates, their rifles ready, fanning out as they approached. Sarah's stomach clenched with fear, not for herself now, but for Two Rivers. "Don't shoot," she called out, her voice hoarse from disuse and cold. "Please don't shoot. He saved my life." But they were still too far away for her words to carry clearly. The soldiers continued their advance, weapons trained on Two Rivers. To Sarah's amazement, Two Rivers didn't run or reach for his own weapons. Instead, he stopped walking and slowly raised his hands, showing he meant no harm. He stood perfectly still, dignified and calm, even as armed soldiers surrounded him. Sarah tried to sit up on the travois, desperate to make the soldiers understand, but pain shot through her leg and she cried out. The sound of her voice seemed to change everything. The soldiers rushed forward, and Sarah began talking rapidly, her words tumbling over each other in her haste. "He saved me. The stagecoach crashed in the blizzard. Everyone else died. He found me and saved my life. Please, you have to understand, he helped me. He set my broken leg. He kept me warm. Probably he brought me here. Please don't hurt him." A man who appeared to be an officer pushed through the group of soldiers. He was older, with gray in his beard and sharp assessing eyes. He looked from Sarah to Two Rivers and back again. "Miss, are you hurt? Did this man harm you in any way?" "No," Sarah said emphatically. "I told you, he saved me. I would have died in that storm if not for him. He treated my injuries. He gave me food and shelter. He's been nothing but kind to me." She clutched the carved charm Two Rivers had given her, holding it up as evidence. "He gave me this for protection. He's a good man. Please, you have to believe me." The officer studied her face carefully, perhaps looking for signs of deception or fear. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, because he lowered his rifle and ordered his men to do the same. "Stand down," he commanded. Then he approached Two Rivers, though his hand remained near his sidearm. "Do you understand English?" Two Rivers nodded slightly. "Some," he said, his accent thick but his meaning clear. It was the first time Sarah had heard him speak English, and she realized he had understood at least some of what she had been saying all along. "You found her in the storm?" the officer asked. "Yes. She would die. I bring her here." Two Rivers' words were simple but sufficient. The officer nodded slowly. "The stagecoach out of Carson Station. We've been waiting for it for 3 days. Feared the worst when it didn't arrive." He gestured to two soldiers. "Get the lady inside. Carefully now, her leg is injured. Someone fetch the doctor." Then he turned back to Two Rivers. "You did a good thing here. We're grateful." As the soldiers carefully lifted Sarah from the travois, she reached out toward Two Rivers. "Wait, please. I need to thank him properly. But she didn't know what she needed. "How did you thank someone for saving your life? How did you apologize for the terrible things you had thought about them? How did you say goodbye to someone who had changed everything you believed about the world?" Two Rivers stepped closer, despite the nervous shifting of some of the soldiers. He looked down at Sarah with those dark, intelligent eyes that she had once feared and now found only kind. He spoke in his own language, several sentences that Sarah couldn't understand. But she heard gentleness in his voice, perhaps a blessing or a wish for her good health. "I'm so sorry," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry for how I acted, for the things I said. You were trying to help me and I was so afraid, so ignorant. You're a good man, a better person than I was. Thank you. Thank you for not leaving me to die. Thank you for your patience and kindness. Thank you for everything." Two Rivers seemed to understand the emotion, if not all the words. He reached out and gently touched her shoulder, a brief gesture of acknowledgement. Then he spoke to the officer. "I go now. My family waits." "Of course," the officer said. "But wait just a moment." He turned and called out to one of the soldiers. "Bring supplies. Food, blankets. It's the least we can do." Two Rivers accepted the offered supplies with a nod of thanks. He prepared to leave, gathering the straps of his now empty travois. Sarah watched him, feeling as though something precious was slipping away. "Will I see you again?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Two Rivers looked at her one last time and smiled, that small smile that transformed his face. He said something in his language, then translated simply, "You live is good." Then he turned and began walking back the way he had come, pulling his Travis behind him, heading back into the vast white wilderness as if it were no more challenging than a garden path. Sarah watched until he disappeared from view, becoming just another shadow in the fading light. The soldiers carried her inside the fort, bringing her to the doctor's quarters. The doctor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and gentle hands, examined her thoroughly. He was impressed by the work Two Rivers had done on her leg. "Whoever set this break knew exactly what he was doing," the doctor said as he checked the splints. "Clean break, properly aligned, excellent splinting. You're very lucky, miss. In another few weeks, this should heal well. You might have a slight limp, but you'll walk again. If this hadn't been set properly, well, the outcome could have been very different." Over the following days, as Sarah recovered in the fort's infirmary, she told her story again and again. She told it to the fort commander, who recorded it in his official reports. She told it to the other women at the fort, who listened with wide eyes. She told it to anyone who would listen, and she always told it the same way, emphasizing Two Rivers' skill, his kindness, his honor. Some people believed her readily. Others listened with skepticism, unable to reconcile her story with their own prejudices. A few suggested that perhaps she was confused, that the cold and injury had affected her memory or judgment. But Sarah never wavered in her account. She knew the truth of what had happened, and she refused to let anyone diminish it. She wrote long letters to her parents in Boston, explaining everything. She described her terror in the storm, her injuries, and her rescue. But most importantly, she wrote about her shame at her own fear and prejudice, and about the lesson she had learned from Two Rivers. "I was so certain I knew who he was before I ever met him," she wrote. "I had created a monster from stories and fears, and I almost died because of my own ignorance. He showed me that humanity transcends all the boundaries we create, all the categories we try to force people into. He was simply a good person who chose to help someone in need, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that gift." When Sarah was well enough to move around on crutches, she began her work at the settlement school. The children who came to her classroom were a mixture of settlers' children and a few children from peaceful tribes who lived near the fort. Sarah taught them all with equal care, and she made sure to include in her lessons stories about kindness, about looking beyond differences, about the dangers of prejudice. She kept the carved charm Two Rivers had given her, wearing it always on a cord around her neck. When people asked about it, she told them the story. Some thought it was inappropriate for a proper young lady to wear such a thing. Sarah didn't care. It was a reminder of the most important lesson she had ever learned. Months later, Sarah heard news through traders who moved between the fort and the Lakota camps. Two Rivers had returned safely to his family. He had a wife and a young daughter, the traders said, and he was respected among his people as a skilled hunter and a man of honor. Sarah was glad to hear it, though the news also brought a pang of sadness. Their paths would probably never cross again, but she was wrong. Nearly a year after the blizzard, on a clear spring day, Sarah was working in the small garden behind the schoolhouse when she heard a familiar voice. She turned to see Two Rivers standing at the edge of the garden, accompanied by a woman and a small child. His wife and daughter Sarah realized immediately. Two Rivers spoke in a mixture of English and his own language, with his wife translating some of the words. He had come to see that Sarah was well, he explained. His wife had wanted to meet the woman whose life he had saved. The little girl, perhaps 5 years old, peeked shyly from behind her mother's skirt. Sarah invited them into her small quarters, serving them tea and the little bit of food she had. The conversation was halting, complicated by language barriers, but somehow they managed. Two Rivers' wife, whose name Sarah learned was Morningstar, had kind eyes and a gentle manner. She thanked Sarah for speaking well of her husband, for telling the truth about what had happened. "Many do not see him truly," Morningstar said in careful English. "You see with clear eyes now." Sarah nodded, feeling tears threaten again. "He gave me more than my life," she said. "He gave me the chance to become a better person than I was." Before they left, Two Rivers' daughter approached Sarah shyly and held out something. A small carved bird, similar to the charm Sarah wore, but smaller, simpler. A child's first attempt at carving, Sarah realized. Two Rivers explained that his daughter had made it for her, wanting to give Sarah a gift, as her father had done. Sarah accepted it with trembling hands, thanking the little girl with all the Lakota words she had learned. The child smiled, pleased, and ran back to her mother. As the family prepared to leave, Sarah felt the need to say one more thing. I was wrong about so many things, she told Two Rivers. I judged you before I knew you. I feared you because of what others had told me to fear. You had every reason to leave me in that snow, to let me face the consequences of my own prejudice. But you didn't. You chose kindness when I had shown you only fear. I will never forget that, and I promise you I will spend my life teaching others what you taught me. Two Rivers listened to her words, understanding more than she might have expected. He reached out and briefly clasped her hand, a gesture of friendship and respect. You teach children? He asked. Yes, Sarah said. Good, he nodded. Teach them to see truly. Teach them heart is same, all people. Teach them fear is sometimes wrong. I will, Sarah promised. I absolutely will. Years later, Sarah's journal would be published, and her account of those 3 days in the cave would become widely read. Some dismissed it as exaggeration or romance. Others found in it a powerful message about overcoming prejudice and recognizing common humanity. But for Sarah herself, the story was simply the truth, a truth that had transformed her from a frightened girl who saw monsters in differences into a woman who understood that courage, kindness, and honor existed in all cultures, all peoples. She kept both carved charms for the rest of her life, hanging them together on her wall. And whenever she looked at them, she remembered the Lakota warrior who had saved her life by refusing to honor her fear, who had touched her only to heal her, and who had given her the greatest gift possible, the chance to see the world, and herself, with new eyes.